There is a specific kind of exhaustion that nobody talks about, not the tiredness that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. This is something else entirely. It's the exhaustion of being in a room full of people, nodding at the right moments, saying the right things, laughing when laughter is expected, and simultaneously running an entirely separate process underneath all of that. Analyzing the tension in someone's voice that doesn't match their words. Noticing the small contradiction between what was said 3 minutes ago and what's being said now. Feeling the weight of what isn't being spoken far more acutely than what is. Tracking the emotional undercurrent of the room while also trying to appear like you're just having a normal conversation. And when you finally get home, when the door closes and the noise stops, you don't feel relieved. You feel emptied. Not because anything bad happened, because being present in that way costs something real, and nobody around you seems to pay the same price. If that description landed somewhere specific in you, if it named something you've carried for years without quite having the words for it, then what we're going to examine in this video is not a self-help framework. It's not a list of personality traits to feel good about. It's an argument, a specific, philosophically grounded argument about what deep introspection actually is, what it costs, and why Wayne Dyer spent the last 2 decades of his life making the case that the people who struggle most with the surface of existence are often the ones living closest to something the surface was never designed to hold. There is a version of introspection that the culture tolerates, the kind that produces insight, publishes it neatly, and then participates normally in everything else. That version is celebrated. But there is another version, the version most of you watching this actually live, where the introspection is not optional, where it runs continuously, where it touches everything, colors every interaction, makes simplicity feel like a kind of dishonesty. That version is not celebrated. That version is diagnosed, pathologized, gently and sometimes not so gently corrected. You've been told you overthink. You've been told you're too sensitive. You've been told that life would be easier if you could just let things go, be more present, worry less about meaning. And the cruelest part is that you believed it, at least partially, because the evidence seemed to be everywhere. Other people move through the world with less friction. Other people don't lie awake reconstructing conversations. Other people seem to belong to the world in a way that you never quite have. Wayne Dyer had a specific term for what you actually are. He didn't use it as a compliment in the motivational sense. He used it as a description of a structural reality. In The Sacred Self, published in 1995, Dyer identified what he called the witnessing presence, the dimension of consciousness that observes experience without being consumed by it. Most people, he argued, live almost entirely identified with the content of their mind. The thoughts, the emotions, the social roles, the narratives. They are the conversation they're having. They are the mood they're in. They are the opinion they're defending. But some people, and this is not a spiritual achievement, Dyer was clear about this, it's more like a constitutional fact. Some people cannot fully collapse into that identification. There's always something watching. Always something that steps back. Always something that notices the noticing. And that, Dyer said, is not a malfunction. It's proximity to what he called the sacred self, the dimension of human consciousness that exists prior to the ego's constructions, closer to source, further from the noise, and genuinely structurally incompatible with a world that runs on noise. That incompatibility is not metaphorical. It produces real friction, specific friction, and that friction has a shape. 8 distinct struggles that people with deep introspection carry, often their entire lives, often without knowing that what they're experiencing is not a problem to be solved, but a signature to be understood. The first struggle is this. You cannot participate in a conversation that has no actual content without feeling something drain out of you. Not boredom exactly. Something more specific. A kind of interior withdrawal, as if some part of you goes offline and waits. Small talk is not a neutral experience for you. It's an active suppression of your default mode. While others move easily through exchanges about weather, weekend plans, traffic, television, you are doing something that costs. You are translating yourself into a register that doesn't fit. You're not being pretentious. You're not looking down. You are genuinely unable to experience the surface of a conversation as sufficient when you know with a certainty you didn't choose that there's more underneath. William James, in his 1890 work, The Principles of Psychology, described consciousness not as a series of discrete states, but as a stream. Continuous, layered, impossible to fully stop. For most people, James said, the stream can be channeled into relatively narrow grooves of practical attention. But for others, the stream is wider and deeper and harder to redirect. It goes where it goes. You cannot will yourself into enjoying shallow water. And Wayne Dyer, who read James carefully and cited him in Being in Balance in 2006, made the point that this inability is not rudeness or elitism. It is the literal experience of a mind that cannot reduce itself without cost. The cost is not imaginary. You feel it every time you leave a party early, every time you fade in a group conversation, every time someone asks why you're so quiet and you don't have an answer that would make sense in that context. The second struggle follows directly from the first. You read subtext involuntarily. You don't choose to notice the hesitation in someone's answer, or the word they selected instead of the more obvious one, or the emotional register that doesn't match the surface content of what they said. You notice it the way you notice sound, not because you're looking for it, but because it arrives. This makes you a more accurate reader of people than most. It also makes relationships slower, more complicated, and sometimes more exhausting than they need to be. Because once you've perceived something, a tension, an omission, an inconsistency, you cannot unperceive it. You carry it. You process it. You return to it. And the person across from you has no idea any of this is happening, which means you are perpetually managing a relational reality that the other person doesn't have access to. Dyer spoke about this directly in several of his lecture series recorded in the early 2000s. He described what he called the burden of sensitivity. Not sensitivity in the therapeutic sense, but in the perceptual sense. The ability to pick up information that others miss is not separable from the obligation to carry it. You don't get the perception without the weight. Here is something worth pausing on, because what I've just described, the stream consciousness, the subtext reading, the involuntary processing, might sound like a kind of hypervigilance. And there are clinicians who would frame it that way. But Dyer's argument in The Sacred Self was more precise and more interesting than that framing allows. He distinguished between anxiety-driven vigilance, which is reactive and exhausting, and what he called the naturally expanded field of awareness, which is structural, which is how some people are simply built. The distinction matters because the intervention is completely different. Anxiety-driven hypervigilance needs calming. An expanded field of awareness doesn't need calming. It needs context. It needs to understand what it is before it can stop fighting itself. The third struggle. You get tired in ways that have no visible cause. You can sleep 8 hours and still feel depleted after a morning that was, by any external measure, unremarkable. A 1-hour meeting that required sustained social performance can leave you needing an hour of silence to recalibrate. This is not weakness. It is not a mood disorder. It is the metabolic cost of processing at a density that others around you simply don't. The cognitive science literature has a term for this, the default mode network, which refers to the set of brain regions active when the mind is not focused on an external task. In most people, this network quiets during social interaction. In people with high introspective capacity, research suggests it remains partially active. You are running multiple processes simultaneously. You are always, at some level, thinking about the thinking. That is expensive, computationally expensive. And the exhaustion is not in your head. It is in the head. It is what the head is doing at all times. Dyer didn't use neuroscience in this context. His framework was more phenomenological than empirical. But the pattern he described in The Sacred Self, of the witnessing presence that never fully disengages, maps precisely onto what researchers would later find in default mode network activity in highly introspective individuals. The fourth struggle is what Viktor Frankl called hyperintentionality, a term he used in man's search for meaning and expanded in The Will to Meaning. It describes the condition of a person who cannot act without first establishing, with some degree of clarity, why they are acting. This is not procrastination. It is not indecision in the common sense. It is a fundamentally different relationship to action, one that requires meaning to precede movement. Most people do things because they feel like doing them, because it's expected, because it's convenient. The introspective person cannot fully detach the act from its ground. Ask them to change careers without understanding what the career was for. Ask them to end a relationship without working out what the relationship meant. Ask them to make a decision quickly without giving them time to understand the implications of each option. The friction is real. The delay is real. But Frankl's argument, and Dyer built on this directly in Excuses Be Gone, published in 2009, was that this need for meaning before movement is not pathology. It is the signature of a consciousness that refuses to operate mechanically. And the world, which runs largely on mechanical operation, will always experience that refusal as obstruction. The fifth struggle is the one that costs the most in daily life. Small decisions carry disproportionate weight. You are the person who spends 12 minutes choosing between two options at a restaurant, not because you're indecisive in any meaningful sense, but because your mind finds the decision interesting, finds the implications worth considering, and cannot simply treat it as trivial just because it is, in practical terms, trivial. Other people find this maddening. Sometimes you find it maddening. But what's actually happening is that your processing system is not calibrated to the size of the decision. It's calibrated to the act of deciding, to the nature of choice itself. Abraham Maslow, in his research on self-actualizing individuals, published in Motivation and Personality in 1954, noted that people at the higher ranges of psychological development often experience a form of what he called democratic consciousness, the tendency to find significance in ordinary things that others pass over. This is not the same as being precious or self-important. It is the consequence of a mind that does not have a filter that labels certain things as unworthy of attention. Everything gets looked at. Everything gets felt. Everything costs something. Stop for a moment. Because I want to say something that the argument so far has not quite gotten to yet. You have probably, at various points in your life, genuinely tried to change this about yourself, not because someone told you to, though they did, but because the friction was real, and you thought that if you could just operate more efficiently, think less, feel less, process less, you would finally be at ease. You read the books, you tried the practices, you attempted the simplifications, and some of them helped in some contexts. But the fundamental architecture didn't change. Because it can't change. Not in the way you were hoping. And I think you already know this, which is why you're here. Which is why something in you keeps coming back to questions like this one. Not looking for comfort, exactly, but looking for someone to tell you the truth about what you actually are, rather than what you ought to become. What you are is not a problem that failed to get solved. And the next three struggles will make clear why. The sixth struggle is a specific kind of solitude, not loneliness in the general sense, not the absence of people. This is the solitude of someone whose natural resolution of experience is internal, whose primary relationship is with their own mind, and who cannot pretend otherwise without it costing something. You can be in a room full of people who love you and still feel fundamentally alone. Not because the love isn't real, but because the processing of that love happens in a place no one else has access to. Dyer wrote about this in a passage in Being in Balance that tends to be overlooked in favor of his more prescriptive chapters. He described solitude not as isolation, but as the natural state of a mind that has developed past the point where external stimulation is sufficient to fill it. The mind that thinks deeply enough creates its own interior landscape, vast enough that the outside world, however good, cannot quite match its scale. This is not sadness. It is a structural condition. Maslow identified it independently. The self-actualizing individuals in his studies reported a high comfort with solitude alongside a genuine capacity for deep connection. The two are not contradictory. They are, in fact, complementary. The depth of connection you can offer when you do connect is directly proportional to the depth of the interior you've built alone. The seventh struggle is the inner critic, but not in the way that phrase is usually meant. The introspective person's inner critic is not a distortion. It's an accurate instrument that's been miscalibrated to run too often and on too many things. You hold yourself to standards of honesty, coherence, and integrity that you don't expect others to meet because you know they can't see what you can see. But you can see it, which means you're subject to it. You catch yourself in contradictions others would never notice. You replay decisions not out of anxiety, but out of genuine desire to understand whether you acted with integrity. You edit yourself more than you edit others because you know your own interior more fully than you know theirs. And with that knowledge comes accountability. Dyer described this in The Sacred Self as the consequence of advanced self-witnessing. When you can see yourself clearly, you see yourself failing clearly too. The problem isn't the seeing. The problem is mistaking the instrument for the verdict. The inner critic is data. It is not the judge. And that brings us to the eighth struggle, the deepest one, the one that often goes unnamed because naming it feels like admitting something you're not sure you're allowed to admit. The struggle of not knowing where you belong. Not in the geographic sense, not in the professional sense, but in the fundamental sense. You have never quite fit the social containers that existed around you. Not fully, not without some translation. Every group you've been part of has required you to leave some part of yourself outside, to compress, to edit, to perform a simpler version. And there's a part of you that has interpreted this persistent mismatch as evidence that something is wrong with you. That you are too much, too complicated, too slow in the ways the world wants you fast, too fast in the ways the world wants you slow. Here is what Dyer said in a 1999 interview that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. He was asked about the experience of never quite fitting in, his fatherless childhood, his early career as an outsider academic, his decision to leave the university system entirely in 1974 to drive across America selling "The Sky's the Limit" from the trunk of his car. He said something to the effect of, "The people who never quite belonged anywhere are often the ones who eventually realize they weren't supposed to. Not because they're special." He was careful about that word, but because belonging to a particular place requires accepting the perceptual contract of that place. And some people are constitutionally unable to sign a contract they can see is incomplete. He would go on to develop this idea through The Sacred Self and Into the Power of Intention, published in 2004. The argument, stripped of its spiritual vocabulary, is this: a person with deep introspective capacity is not someone who failed to assimilate. They are someone whose assimilation would have required them to abandon the most functional part of themselves, the witnessing presence, the layer that observes, that questions, that refuses to collapse into the consensus reality of whatever room they're standing in. Belonging, for such a person, is not a social achievement. It is an interior condition. You belong to your own depth before you belong to any group. And the tragedy is not that you don't fit. It's that you've spent years interpreting the not fitting as a failure rather than as information. Now here is where the 8 struggles converge into a single point. Each of these 8 struggles, the surface conversation that costs you, the involuntary subtext reading, the exhaustion with no visible cause, the need for meaning before action, the weight of small decisions, the structural solitude, the precise inner critic, the mismatch with belonging, each one is the same thing wearing a different face. Each one is the direct consequence of operating at a level of internal resolution that most of the world does not operate at. Dyer's concept of the sacred self was his attempt to give that level a name, to say, there is a dimension of you that was never going to fit comfortably into the ordinary psychological containers. And this is not an accident, and it is not a wound, and it is not something to be fixed. He knew this from the inside. In 1976, 2 years after leaving his academic position, Dyer was on a radio program being challenged by a host who found his ideas impractical, even indulgent. The host kept pressing. What about people who just need to pay rent, raise children, get through the day? And Dyer said, and I'm paraphrasing from the transcript that was later included in a collection of his early media appearances, that the question itself assumed that getting through the day and living fully were 2 different activities. That the person who processes life at depth is not less efficient. They are more honest about what efficiency is for. In 2001, Dyer was diagnosed with leukemia. He continued to write and lecture through the treatment. What changed, by his own account, was not his ideas, but his relationship to time. The urgency to convert other people to his framework dissolved. What remained was something quieter. A settled recognition that the way he had always processed the world, the interior weight, the involuntary analysis, the inability to accept surface as sufficient, was not a defect he had heroically overcome. It was the thing itself, the thing that produced everything he had made. Here is what I want to be precise about, because this is where it matters. Saying that your introspective depth is a strength is not the same as saying it doesn't hurt. It does hurt. It hurt Dyer, too. The 5th of Dyer's 8 children, Shane Dyer, gave an interview in 2016 in which he talked about what it was like growing up with a father who was simultaneously present and elsewhere, always processing, always at some interior remove, always in some sense occupied by something you couldn't see. That is a real cost. The people around you pay it. You pay it. The solitude is not comfortable just because it's structural. The exhaustion is not energizing just because it's meaningful. The inability to belong is not peaceful just because it's honest. But here is the distinction Dyer was drawing in. The sacred self, and it is a distinction worth holding carefully. There is the pain of being what you are. And then there is the additional pain of fighting what you are. The second kind of pain, the self-correction, the performance of simplicity, the repeated attempts to be more like the people who move through the world with less friction. That pain produces nothing. It has no yield. It does not make you simpler. It makes you exhausted and simple performing, which is the worst of both options. William James, in a lecture delivered at Harvard in 1906, made an argument about what he called the twice-born soul, a person who has passed through a genuine interior crisis and emerged with a different relationship to experience. James was careful to note that this category is not morally superior. It is simply different in how it processes existence. The twice-born soul, James said, cannot return to the state of mind that preceded the crisis. And spending energy trying to return is precisely what prevents the arrival at something new. Dyer read James. Dyer was, by his own description, a twice-born soul in exactly James's sense. His transformation, beginning in the mid-1970s, accelerating through his encounters with the Tao Te Ching in the 1990s, completing into something quieter and more radical in the years after his diagnosis. And what Dyer concluded in the final decade of his writing was that the people who process the world at depth are not waiting to be fixed. They are waiting for something more accurate, to be understood correctly. So let me say it as directly as I know how. The conversation that drains you is not evidence that something in you is broken. It is evidence that you cannot pretend substance is optional. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is the metabolic signature of a mind doing something most minds don't do. The inner critic is not a malfunction. It is an instrument of integrity that needs calibration, not removal. The solitude is not failure. It is the natural shape of an interior large enough to require its own space. And the belonging that has always felt incomplete, the fact that you've never fully arrived anywhere, never fully signed the perceptual contract. That is not rejection. That is you remaining accurate about what you are, even when accuracy is socially costly. Dyer said, in the closing pages of The Sacred Self, something that I return to often because it refuses to be simplified. He wrote that the self that witnesses is the self that was never born and will never die. The part of you that has been watching your whole life without flinching, without leaving, without needing you to be different in order to stay. That may sound like philosophy at a distance, but if you are someone who has lived with the weight of deep introspection, who has carried these 8 struggles, who has tried to be simpler and failed, who has wondered in the quiet moments whether the mismatch is yours or the world's, then that sentence is not abstract. It is a description of the thing that has never abandoned you, even when you tried to abandon it. You don't have to fight it anymore, not because the fighting was wrong, but because you've now seen what it cost, and what it produced, and what it didn't produce, and the accounting doesn't favor continued expenditure. The silence after a long day of being yourself in a world that wanted you to be something easier. That silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of a mind that has finally been given permission to stop translating. You built something real in that interior. The 8 struggles are its architecture, not its flaws. Dyer spent 40 years making the same argument in 40 different registers. That the path inward is not a retreat from life. It is a more accurate entry into it. That what looks like complication from the outside is, from the inside, the only kind of clarity that was ever available to you. And that the people who experience the world at this resolution, at this cost, with this loneliness, with this precision, are not people who need to become simpler. They are people who have been waiting for the world to become more honest. It won't, entirely. But that's a different problem. Come back to the room where this began, the conversation you were translating yourself for, the surface you were performing, the process running underneath that nobody could see. You're still in that room, in some version. You'll be in versions of it for the rest of your life. But something has shifted in what it means. The cost is still real. The friction is still real. What's changed is the explanation. And the explanation changes everything, not because it removes the difficulty, but because it stops you from treating the difficulty as evidence against yourself. The 8 struggles are not 8 problems. They are 8 proofs. Of depth, of precision, of a kind of consciousness that was never going to be comfortable in a world optimized for speed and surface. Dyer knew this about himself. He lived it, wrote it, and then spent the last decade of his life not trying to fix it, but trying to understand it more completely. Now it's your turn. Of these 8 struggles, which one did you spend the most years trying to fix, before you realized it might not be a flaw at all? Leave it in the comments. I want to know which one cost you the most to carry before you understood what it was.